All right. Welcome to Stereo Psych. I don't have sound on, so I don't actually know if it's recording or not, but let's just assume that it is. Today we'll be doing this one. All right, sorry. I'm Stephen Downing, a clinical psychologist from Australia. You'd think I'd be doing that by now. I usually break down Am I the Asshole Reddit posts, just as something which is fun to do in my lunch break. Um, this one just didn't fill me with joy. So I went to the other Am I the Asshole thread, and this one's got my attention, partially because it seems a bit wild out there. We're going to do this one mainly for my amusement, and let's go from there. So I'll read it from beginning to end, and then I'll give some thoughts on it. So, am I the asshole for laughing when my brother's girlfriend told me her dog is vegetarian? We had a Memorial Day cookout at our family cabin this past Sunday. My younger brother, Joe, brought his girlfriend, Amy, who he's been with for about 18 months. Joe's previously asked if it was okay if Amy brought her dog with her. We're a very dog-friendly family, so obviously that's fine. My family has a dog, and my cousin has one as well. When Joe and Amy arrived, I was just about to feed my dog, and Amy asked if I could do it somewhere else because she didn't want her dog to eat different food due to its diet. I thought it's a little weird, but wanted to accommodate our guests, so I took the dog to the garage to feed him quick. Later, I was playing fetch with my dog and my cousin's dog, and I was going to give him treats afterwards. I asked Amy if she wanted me to grab one for her dog. She said no, and I didn't press further. We cooked up hot dogs and burgers, and I tossed my dog the last bite of my hot dog. When I did that, Amy asked me if I thought it was a good idea because of all the junk that's in a hot dog. I joked that I've seen my dog eat things way worse than hot dogs all on his own, so I'm not too worried about a small bite of hot dog. She said all the chemicals and processed stuff in hot dogs isn't good for dogs, and she feeds her dog an all-natural organic diet. I told her I'd never heard of that for dogs and asked her what she feeds a dog. She said that her dog is a vegetarian, so she doesn't give it any meat-based foods or treats. I thought she was joking, and I started laughing, but no, she was dead serious. Joe chimed in to say that it's true. That the dog refuses to eat meat of any kind. I said this must be some kind of joke because no dog's a vegetarian. Amy got defensive and said that her dog has always been a vegetarian and will turn its nose up at any meat-based item. I told her that she's lying to herself if she thinks that's true, and the dog would 100% eat a hot dog out of my hand right now if I let it. I told her the dog needs meat and protein in its diet, and she's the one forcing her dog to eat a vegetarian diet. The dog is not choosing that for itself. She said that at least she doesn't give her dog ultra-processed things like hot dogs, and I said at least I allow my dog to be a dog, and I would never deprive a dog of its primary source of protein, which is meat. I said that dogs didn't evolve to be vegetarians and that she can feed her dog whatever she wants, but she should at least own up to the fact that she's forcing her dog to have that diet. The dog isn't choosing that. Joe and Amy left right after they finished eating, barely saying goodbye. I later got a text from Joe that I was being an asshole to Amy about her dog. I told him that the only asshole I saw was a dog owner who's forcing their dog into having a diet that it isn't meant to have. Okay, so am I the asshole? Is he the asshole in this situation? He's a bit of an asshole, right? Is he an asshole with a cause? Potentially. I'm not against that idea, but still, yes, there's some asshole in that. Why do I say he's an asshole? Essentially, you can present the argument that dogs need meat separate to you're lying to yourself, and that essentially that you're lying to yourself or that you're a liar regarding your dog, right? Because we don't actually know that, and this individual at this point in time does not know whether or not that dog would accept meat. Now we suspect it because she makes him feed his dog separately so that her dog wouldn't eat it, which means like if there was a risk that her dog would simply turn his nose up at it, you could safely feed the dog in front of. But for the sake of charity, we're saying we can't know for sure, right? Again, this channel is about modeling thinking as a psychologist, which means we don't go making assumptions. It's potentially true that her dog actually refuses meat-based products, right? What else? He said something else that I kind of went, you didn't need to say that. Can't say it. Yeah. Now, you know, if he's an asshole, not a major asshole, but I guess there are other ways to go about this conversation. And the reason I'll do it is true. Let's say, hypothetically, this bloke is concerned about the dog in question, right? Attacking the owner doesn't help either him or the dog or the owner, right? And people are gonna be like, oh, attacking. Yes, I use the word deal with it, all right? The way that he reports he's saying it. If she was telling me the same story from her perspective, I would say that I would get a slightly different view, which would be, let's just say, potentially more details than this, which I think would indicate that probably more was said. But again, we're not making assumptions. I'm saying I'm expecting that he's given the charitable view here, and that even the charitable view, he's not said things in a way that is particularly effective, right? And this is not the way to approach somebody who's doing this. Why? People do mention that I bang on about values a lot. Well, I'm back to values again. If somebody has values around meat-based products and stuff like that, then often those values are quite strong and often quite valid, right? I say that, right? So nobody needs to know, but I essentially have been carnivore for the past year because of a whole bunch of allergies, right? I could barely eat anything that grows from the ground without having a reaction. And so I functionally became a carnivore. Now, if somebody was to look at me and basically say, oh, you must hate the earth and all that kind of stuff, and look at all you, I accept my diet has not been particularly good for the earth, but I also wanted to live and not live in anaphylaxis all the time. So, there are actually some reasons why people do this that have very little to do with values. My values are not in line with a carnivore diet. I don't buy the bro science. I just wanted to live without pain, right? So if somebody was to then go and attack me on the basis of my diet, they're not understanding that like I do this because I have to, literally, right? Which is funny. I had a very respectful conversation with a vegan once upon a time in the past year that went along those lines, and they sort of understood, oh, yeah, fair enough. If that's your health issues, then yeah, not my choice. But I understand why you got to do that. And I was able to go, yeah, like I respect your worldview and the way you do stuff. Like, go you. I don't agree with it to the extent that I'm on board with it, but I can respect your values and what you do. Go nuts. Now, if somebody takes that and translates it to their dog, are they necessarily hurting their dog? Well, no, actually, protein's not particularly special. If anything of the last year has shown me, it's that, yeah, sure, meat is one of the best ways that you can get protein. That's not the only way. It's not even close to the only way. There are lots of vegetarian societies that do incredibly well. So I don't have any dramas with that. Do I think it's best? No, I don't think vegetarian is best. Do I think carnivore is best? No, I don't think carnivore. Actually, I know from experience carnivore is not the best, but hey, a sample of one, right? This is about the values that underpin it. And there's a very big difference between somebody not eating something because they can't. So hypothetically, why do I bring that up? If this dog has learned from past experience that it actually can't tolerate meat, it could literally turn its nose up at meat, and she could be 100% correct. She might not, in fact, be a liar, and her dog might not tolerate meat. Have I ever heard of that? No, that's a stretch. I will admit it's a stretch. Is it theoretically possible? Yes. Some humans are allergic to their own sweat. At that point, anything is possible. So, I'm going to live in that world at the moment. But again, I accept that. Do I think this way personally when I'm in this situation? Not necessarily. This is the professional style of thinking where we don't make assumptions, and until we get the actual evidence, we don't make assumptions that we're wrong. There's evidence in here that would indicate that she is in fact wrong, and he would eat because we see that she makes them eat separately. But that's not hard evidence. It just is reason to suspect that actually this dog would be more than happy to eat meat. Right. Outside of that, where are we with this situation? I think one of the reasons I wanted to tackle this was the idea of how do you approach people who have values like this that are different to your own, right? So I do not share her values. I think that a dog's healthy diet includes meat, right? If you can't afford meat, mince, wet food, I can understand feeding your dog a diet of some meat-based plus grain dog food. If that's all you can afford to feed your dog, go nuts. I'm not here to judge you. What a wonderful human feeding your dog. Please take care of your dog and don't just take care of it in its food. Take care of all of your dog. Can your dog live healthily on that? Yep. No issues at all, right? I'm more interested in the values of somebody who, according to this person, forces their dog to be a vegetarian, right? And I think that's where we've got to start going, well, hang on a second. You know, if this is about animals and stuff like that, I get curious about somebody who has strong values around animals and yet owns animals in a way that is clearly unnatural. Like, I can accept there's an argument, well, if I didn't, somebody else would, and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, there's some inconsistencies there. But at the end of the day, how do you deal with somebody whose values are, like in this case, way out of line compared to your own, and you think that they're wrong, right? I would encourage you to first off be thinking about how much does it matter, right? So in this situation, I would be sitting there asking myself, do I care, right? Can this dog physically live a healthy diet as a dog vegetarian? If you look at the dog and go, well, they look fairly healthy to me, and you're not a vet, live and let live, right? That is the basis on which I say this bloke doesn't actually need to take the issue that he does, right? However, you will then say to me, but then she gets up him for feeding his dog some whatever, hot dog, and gets in trouble from her about it. Now, at this point, I just feel like, you know, this is where people go, how do you know a vegan's a vegan? They tell you, right? And everybody laughs. They very often, they in fact do. And this is a sort of situation that's like it. And people say, well, now she's opened herself up for what she gets. He's just retaliating. She accuses him of this. He accuses her of that. And I would say, yeah, it's entirely fair. That's entirely fair given the situation. Yep. Is this a tit for tat situation? Yes. Sometimes would it be better to let it go? Potentially. If you actually care about the dog in the situation, this is not how to sway the dog owner's opinion, right? You sway the dog owner's opinion in other ways, right? People are not going to be like, well, now I have to feed my dog meat because Joe's brother thinks I'm an asshole. That is not how opinions change, right? Sometimes people do ask me about this. So something that's worth bearing in mind, and this is something I just sort of remember for a long time. When you've got essentially these sorts of things, right? You need to understand there are 3 levels of, I don't even know what you would call it, concepts. Essentially, there are beliefs, attitudes, and values, right? Generally speaking, beliefs are the easiest to change. Attitudes are incredibly difficult to change, and values are virtually set in stone, right? But being a vegan is not a value, right? Being a vegan is probably closer to an attitude, right? You rarely were people born vegan, right? And values around justice and bits and pieces like that can lead one to be a vegetarian or a vegan, but not necessarily be a value themselves, right? So when we think about values, we're talking about really concrete things, you know, justice, fairness, love, I can't even think of other ones at the moment. Like, they are a concrete thing. They are not a common belief, right? Marriage is not a value. Marriage is based on values, and so therefore people hold to it. But marriage itself is not a value. It is underpinned by values, right? And so we need to be able to separate positions from that. But you've got to understand sometimes that when you're looking at this and you're dealing with something like an attitude, which generally speaking, I would say that this is an attitude, is a belief set that sits in a direction where the beliefs are self-reinforcing to the extent where they are very difficult to shift. Because to work with any one belief, you have to work with the set, or you get no impact, right? So that's why I bring in that sort of 3-tiered system. I forget what subject we learned this in. It was just something that stuck in my head around, that actually makes sense to me. As somebody that was raised in religious circles, and I'm religious myself, I have had a front row seat to lots of people who have values, but that underpin attitudes and belief sets which are not necessarily congruent or outright hypocritical, right? And I think that it's something that you can see generally, but I've certainly observed firsthand in religious circles. Like, one that often gets me is Christian attitudes towards refugees. Some people find it impossible to separate their I don't know, the values that underpin ideas of sovereignty of countries and things like that from the values of mercy and the need to help other people that are in strange situations. And you can wind up in some really convoluted, hypocritical arguments where you have value sets that support opposing positions that you end up coming down hard on one side or the other instead of developing a nuanced opinion, right? So I would personally think that that's somewhat of a lazy way to think when you just come down on one side or the other to save yourself the effort of producing a nuanced position. But it's how things like this go. And so you end up with, this is what we would sort of call black or white thinking, where we narrow down on one side, which excludes other kinds of thinking, right? Which can produce a situation where you go, well, because being a vegetarian is good for the environment, being a vegetarian is now a moral responsibility of my dog. It was a natural carnivore, just chucking that out there. He eats virtually nothing aside from meat in the wild. You know, why do I think that matters? Because I have values around that animals should be treated as well as they can, and where they are pets, etc., we should endeavor to make their life as good as possible, and if they are in a zoo or whatever, as close to the natural world as possible. And so that's where I start to differentiate from somebody like this. And you can see my value set that starts to come forward, right? I don't need to make statements about her character to put forward a view that says it's really important that animals get to live in a way that is most consistent with how they naturally would, because they haven't had a huge amount of time to adapt to our sort of domestic life, and therefore they might need to have that more basic life as part of their need set, where we, particularly as omnivores, are very well adapted to a wide range of diets, and we can hold that moral position and its consequences kind of without very many consequences, as long as we put in the effort and plan. But the dog actually can't do that, and therefore we want to be really careful before we're making decisions on their behalf, right? And trying to sort of approach things like this from that more nuanced position of going, I understand where you're coming from, and I actually probably even agree with your value set. I get to a different place, but you're free to live your life. But how do we have a conversation about this situation, which I'm uncomfortable about, whilst respecting your boundaries, but putting forward that I'm not sure that you've fully considered where your dog might sit in this, and I'm concerned about the fact that they don't have a voice in this. Could I put a different opinion forward in a way that gives your dog a voice? And that allows, I mean, who of us is talking like that in real life? I'm talking that is, I would want that to be the attitude or the drive of how you are speaking, such that that idea comes through in the way that you're talking, because it doesn't sort of get people offside and put their hackles up. And now all that's happened is I've shut down the conversation, right? So to go back to the asshole situation, is this person an asshole? If they wanted to improve the dog's life, they should not take this approach. If they wanted to score points in an argument, then that's really to nobody's benefit, right? And it's just, I got jabbed, so I jabbed back. It's not to say it's not fair, but it doesn't really accomplish anything, you know? So I think when you're up against something like this and you're kind of going, right, how do you approach this situation when you are dealing with people, be they from whatever walk of life? I think it is sometimes useful to kind of go, what am I dealing with here? And if you realize you're up against an attitude, you need to think about, do I have the mental energy to throw at this? Because 9 times out of 10, you're going to get nowhere except having spent a whole bunch of energy getting nowhere. If it's a belief, right, just an incorrect belief of some kind that is quite easily corrected with information to where they would modify that individual belief, by all means, go nuts. People are often quite open to modifying them when presented with new information, right? Very often what I find is people are up against either attitudes or value sets. And when you're doing that, you're talking about longer term work. People do not quickly change it unless they are confronted with a situation that changes it, right? So one thing that I would say is, so the refugees, I use that intentionally earlier because the way that I have seen people's attitudes around refugees change is not having conversations about refugees. I have been party to a lot of them, and they have never once actually changed somebody's opinion towards refugees, at least certainly not from the way that I want the change to happen, right? But you know what did was meeting refugees. And I watched people's attitudes just melt because they were not able to hold that attitude in the face of, instead of saying like, oh, those boat people, now it's Mr. John Doe, the boat person, and I know him, and actually he's a cool guy. And when I heard his story, I sort of went, that sucks, actually. Wow. Yeah, well, some people, they do this other thing where they just create a new category called John Doe, who doesn't belong to category refugee, and he's different because I've met John Doe and he's okay, and everybody else still remains the bad guy. But the more reasonable position is people begin to start to soften their general perspective, and with enough exposure to it, we see an actual attitude change where they might still hold an opinion to some degree, but not as firmly. So my camera's stuffed up here, so I'm going to assume that I've had some kind of technical malfunction. Now, tell you what, can I video, let's do this. There we go. All right, we'll finish off with this one. I tell people I'm a dinosaur and I mean it. I don't have a lot more to say about this kind of a situation. I think it's interesting to think through for sure. I think when you're coming at this, it is useful to have in your mind the idea of, what am I dealing with? Is this sort of attitudes and values, or is this a belief? If it's a belief, engage with it with a good degree of certainty that if you have a good position that you can provide evidence for, there's a chance somebody would change their position. However, if it's a belief or a value, I'd strongly sort of go, one, does it matter? Consider the so what factor. If it doesn't matter, live and let live, because you're just going to spend energy for nothing, as a general rule. If it's a value, you got to think about, do you actually have a problem with the value, or do you have a problem with the thing that sits on top of the value set? Because generally speaking, you can actually use values to find agreement with people and work to different conclusions from there. Like, values are usually points of agreement rather than disagreement. And if somebody sort of like tells you that values are a point of disagreement, unless they are from a completely non-Western culture that might have different values, which is generally unlikely, even non-Western cultures tend to share a huge amount of Western values, then they're probably not talking about values, and they're really talking about attitudes that are built on top of them that they are inflexible on. So that's my thoughts for today. A bit of an interesting one. I specifically wanted to use. I know normally I pick the top one, but here we are. I thought that'd be a pretty fun one to get into. So thanks for coming. Like if you like it, subscribe if you want to see more like this, and I shall catch you around. All right, see you.